let's get this started, everybody. First off, thanks everyone so much for coming to our talk, Stop Building Poop Emoji People Do Not Need, with a subheadline, A Friendly Introduction to Generative Research and Prototyping. So first off, quick introductions. I am Zach. This is Katie. I'm a product strategist. She's an innovation strategist. Behind us is Boba Fett. He's a bounty hunter. He's pretty cool. He's a nice guy. When you see strategists, what do you think? It's really just a fancy way of saying that we work with teams to help them to sort of like take a step back from their product, think critically about it, and basically like there are 1,000 things that you could be doing, especially in these early stages of building products. There's 1,000 things you could be doing. There's usually only about 1 to 5 things that you really should be focusing on in any given moment. And an outside perspective, an outside sort of advisor sort of perspective helps sort of clear things out and really focus on what needs to get done. So that's what we've done. We have been doing this for 4 years together, and then before that, we were working in different product teams. I separated up the logos to like before Joe Lubin and after Joe Lubin. As you can see, like we were doing enterprise stuff before. Afterwards, we've had an opportunity to work with some amazing Web3 teams. And it's been great. We've really been enjoying the space. So the question is pretty much, how do you get good at building stuff that people need, right? There's a lot that goes into that answer. You can talk about working with the right people, collaboration, iterating quickly. But one of the answers, like kind of the simplest answer, is just like, I've had a ton of practice building stuff that people don't need, right? Like this is a logo wall of a whole bunch of projects that I've done from like 2011 to 2019. These are at least 3 months worth of work, some of them up to 18 months, with pivots, with refining the pitches, et cetera. Some of them hit market traction, some of them didn't. But ultimately, there's been a ton of practice that kind of goes into it. So I'm sort of distilling down about like 9 years worth of work into this talk. The TLDR, and I think like what's really important to understand, like whenever you look at like the projects, and I'm sure you can too, right? Like as some people who are perpetually building, you probably have a massive amount of projects that you've been working on that you can kind of point to and go like, oh yeah, I was working on this and I've been through that. The important thing to like remember is that it's really easy to build the wrong thing, right? It's extremely easy, and it's extremely expensive too. One of the problems with this, especially at early stage teams that I've seen, I've interacted with, whenever I was embedded as a product designer, my experience was that design, UX and research is often perceived as like difficult, it's perceived as expensive, time consuming, and oftentimes the last step in the process. We think like, okay, I have the API design, now we need to like sketch out the pane of glass in which people interact with it, right? That's unfortunate because a lot of times the UX and specifically the research is actually the silver bullet that product teams can actually use to kind of get to that product market fit faster, specifically whenever resources are constrained, right? So, and then I think
So when we talk about strategic design, the best way that we can frame it for you is to think about making good bets. So what do we mean when we say that? So we think about the design process as this kind of five-step process that starts with understanding, goes to define, ideate, prototype, and evaluate. Most of you in this room have probably heard of that before. What we love about this, though, is that it's something that we do again and again. The iterative part is the part that's the magic sauce, right? And when I say it's about making good bets, what you need to know about your product is how certain do you need to be? What is the level of good bet that you're willing to take? If we think about something like Iowa last week, to use a prescient example, if you are launching your product and it is going on the main stage to be seen by 1 million people in the Iowa caucus for 2020 election, then your threshold for what a good bet is should be very, very, very high. In this case, it wasn't high enough, right? They launched it, there were a lot of other things wrong, but the app itself was not ready for prime time. We know that now. And so when you're thinking about what you're doing, if you're just launching your app to a couple people you know, or your DApp or your product, then maybe your good bet is a lot lower. If you're going on mainnet for the first time and that's your big, big launch and you only have one chance to get it right, your threshold should be a lot higher. So when we talk about what makes a good strategic bet, the first thing that we like to talk about is research, which often when I hear people talk about research, they say, okay, Katie, I get it, research. I build something and then I talk to some people. And the answer to that is, yes, and, as we like to say in design, it is about building things and talking to people, but it is also about building things with users. Okay, so what do I mean when I say that? Coming back to this kind of iterative loop that we talked about, we see research as a multifaceted approach. So we start with, and then you'll hear researchers talk about these things different ways. I personally like to break research up into 3 categories: formative, generative, and evaluative. Sometimes you'll hear researchers kind of lump formative and generative together, and that's totally fine. They'll call it generative probably, or foundational, or discovery. That's totally fine. I personally like to break them up into 3 for a very specific reason. Formative is about discovering and learning, generative is about making stuff, and evaluative is about refining. So what is formative research? Formative research is discovery, pure and simple. And so it can be about learning about a domain for the very first time. And usually this is a very time-intensive type of research. You're going to go out in the field. You're going to do what we call contextual inquiry. You're going to watch people do stuff in their natural habitats. This is the one that I feel like people mostly gristle at. They're like, "Oh, Katie, that sounds expensive. I have to go out and talk to people in 3 dimensions. That's hard. I don't know." I'll tell you right now, if you are trying to build a product in an industry you are not that familiar with, let's imagine you're building a Web3 dApp in healthcare, but you don't know anything about healthcare. If you don't get out there and understand how HIPAA works, how electronic medical records work, how getting information across state lines, these are all American-based examples, of course, but if you don't understand how those things work, you will launch your dApp and doctors will laugh at you because you didn't do your homework. So this is the kind of research that I want to see people doing. We actually have Affogato right here down front in the room. We're going to talk about them in a little bit. They are champions of formative user research. If you want to know about what formative research looks like, if it's done well, go talk to them. They have spent so much time out in the field with coffee farmers. They're also here selling coffee right now today, so talk to them anyway, because their coffee's awesome. But they know more about spending time with their users than anybody I've ever worked with. So please go talk to them. They have done phenomenal work in this area, and I'm sure they will tell you that it is worth it to get to know what's going on in the minds of your users. So let's move on to generative. When people tell me they know their user, or more often than not, they tell me they are their user, we talk about generative research. So my next question to you is, okay, cool, you're your user. That's super convenient. You know what you need. Do you want to just be the only person, though, that uses your product, or do you want more people using your product than just you? Hopefully, if you want to be making money and having success, you understand that you're not going to be your only user. So if you know your market, if you understand, if you've been in healthcare for 1,000,000 years and you know all those things that we just talked about, that's cool. Let's do generative research, and this is where I see them as separate, formative and generative. Generative to me is making with users. So you can get them with you in the room, co-creating your actual product or service, so that when you're done, you know for sure that you are not the only person who wants to use your product. You also, in the process of generative research, get to build your kind of tribe of evangelists, right? If these people have stake in the game, if they sat with you long hours making your actual product, they're going to be the first ones out on the street telling people about it, getting people to use it, caring about it, and making sure it has a future. They're going to be advisors on your board. They're going to be SMEs that endorse you. This is important. And so for me, this is why I separate generative and formative, and I tell you that even if you can tell me that you have done the formative work because you've lived it, you must do generative research if you want people using your product that aren't just you. And last but not least is evaluative research. So this is the idea of make and then talk to people, right? So this is what people mostly associate with when they talk about research, is usability testing. Getting out in the field, you can see me here, not really in this picture, behind this gentleman using a product on a laptop from a long time ago, back when I wore legit dresses out to sales calls, which I don't do anymore. So evaluative research is about seeing your product in the wild. The things that I swear you think you got right, you think that you did it perfectly, you get it out in the wild. I tweeted about this yesterday. If you find yourself telling a user they did something wrong, you need to be looking in the mirror because you have done something wrong. Your product did something wrong. If you are targeting the right user in the right use case and that person can't use your product, evaluative research is here to save the day. Now, the thing about evaluative research that I hear a lot is people saying, okay, Katie, I need to see as many people as possible. And I'll tell you this, no, you don't. You need to see 5. 5 people at a time. You will get to 80% of the product problems that you are trying to solve in 5 usability tests that can be literally 30 minutes long. There are people in the room. Alex Voto is in the back. He can talk to you about me being a great breaker of Gitcoin. Affogato can tell you I've broken everything they've ever made. I am a perfect person to break your stuff. But if you find yourself telling people that they are breaking your thing or that they are not using it correctly, you need to look in the mirror, because again, you are not going to have the traction you want, and you're going to find out in Iowa on the main stage instead of here in a quiet room with one person where you can actually go change it. So instead of doing 15 usability tests, promise me you'll do 3 rounds of 5 where you actually make those changes in between each one. Okay, people ask me this all the time. Katie, what are the common research mistakes? I will tell you all of these are huge. Everyone who's ever done research should know them. If you tell me that you cannot do any research or not doing any research for your product, that is the biggest mistake you can make. So please talk to one person. One person is better than 0. This chart is here to show you that really, literally, you will find 80% of the problems, the big problems, in 5 usability tests, but you will find 33% in 1. That's not to tell you that you should only do 1. Please don't take that away from this talk. But if you talk to one person, you're going to start seeing things in your product breakdown that you can fix and make better. So 1 is better than 0. 5 is better than 1. Not talking to your broad market is huge. If you guys watch Silicon Valley, you know that this happened in Silicon Valley, where they talk about, oh, you know, we tried Pied Piper out with all of our friends and everyone loved it, and then they launch it to the real world and everyone's like, I have to take a master class to get through what Pied Piper is and why I care about it. Don't be like that, okay? Talk to people that are actually supposed to be your users. If they can't use it and you tell them they're not intelligent, that's on you. We talked about that. Spending too long in any one phase of research. People tell me this all the time. You're saying I have to spend 6 months doing research before I can code. No, I'm not. I'm telling you, you need to spend time switching between research phases while you're also coding. So you shouldn't spend too long in any one phase. And the last, but certainly not least thing I hear all the time is research is not my job. If you are, I'm not a researcher. I'm in product. I'm a CEO. I'm this person. I'm a CTO. I do this thing. If you are invested in your product being successful, research is your job. Research is your job. You must partake in these different things. You must watch usability sessions. You must talk to users, and you must give a shit about what they care about. Because if you don't, your product will not succeed, and you will have only yourself to blame. So if you find yourself telling anybody that research is not your job and you care about your product being successful, you best look in the mirror, because I promise you the day of reckoning will come. All right, and with that, Zach's going to take back over.
Seriously. I thought you were about to start banging your shoe on the podium. Yeah, that was amazing. So once you have done the research, once you've started gathering these asymmetric insights, right? Research is about finding things out that nobody else knows, right? Because your product, your competitive advantage is having secrets that you can embed into your product. Once you start doing that, you move into prototyping. When we say prototyping, I think prototyping is kind of a dangerous word, especially whenever we kind of think about code, because generally speaking, whenever I think about coding a prototype, it's still coding. It's still building out something that more or less kind of works. The important thing to do whenever you think about prototyping in this stage, in this early stage, is that you're sketching out the experience as opposed to the UI, all right? So prototyping is not an MVP. It's really important to understand that, remember, an MVP, there's viable in the name, right? Which means that it's something that you can give out to people and that it'll actually work. That's not what you're doing with the prototyping in the early stages. We've all probably seen this graphic. This is still one of my favorite graphics that have come out of sort of like the UI, UX sort of scene over the last 10 years. Everyone is kind of thinking like, well, how do I build a skateboard? Skateboard's what I want to do. Like eventually I'm going to build a Tesla, but right now it's just a skateboard. There's actually a step before this, right? There's a 0, where there's a 0 step where you're actually building out the prototype. And it's important to think that, like, let's say that I kind of like the idea of a scooter as sort of an example. If we wanted to start building out a scooter, the first thing we would do is not like start bolting wheels on, right? The first thing we do when we build a scooter is actually find a pallet mover. It's effectively the same sort of experience. You don't have to spend a ton of time building stuff out, and you can simulate what the actual experience of using the product is without necessarily like spending a whole bunch of time building stuff. And I think it's really important to understand, right? Like when we talk about prototyping, in the same way that people are worried about research taking forever, people are worried about prototyping taking forever, I would strongly recommend, if this talk has been interesting to you, if you want to continue to research, check out Jake Knapp's book, Sprint. They basically fit the entire process into a week. It's a roller coaster, but it is a week long. They spend about 2 or 3 days, and it has really good examples of prototyping out not just like websites and not just like dApps, but like actual like really complex products that would take years to build. They simulate the experience using smoke and mirrors. So that's what it's really important to think. This is prototyping. This is prototyping out the scooter experience, right? You're figuring out, do people feel safe on this? Is this the right? Is this sort of the right path, et cetera? So prototyping has 4 essential steps. The 4th one is recursive up until a certain point. Remember that graph, the iterative graph? So step 1 is, what is the concept? Step 2, what is the assumption about the idea you want to validate as true? And I think it's really important to understand that when we say assumption, we mean an assumption that is core to your product, all right? So it has to be something that is true, and if it is true, you have a product that people want. If it is false, you're in trouble, right? It dies on the vine. So it's really important that when you think of assumptions, sometimes like whenever we get with teams, we just ask them to like spend 30 minutes, spend an hour writing out what has to be true in order for this to even be something that can actually function in the world as like a product. Meet a market, find customers. That's an important step, and that's what prototyping is meant to either validate or invalidate. Step 3 is, what do you need to prototype in order to evaluate that assumption? And then step 4 is make, test, iterate, repeat. Okay, so it's kind of a recursive loop. So what are you evaluating? It's a spectrum. You have concepts, market interest, customer behavior on the left side. You've got specific solutions on the right side. As a general rule, the earlier you are in the product, the more you're probably to the left. I also think that generally speaking, most teams, myself included, myself especially, is further on the left of the spectrum than I'd like to believe, especially when you first get that idea. You get that idea and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. I cannot wait to make this. But you don't actually validate whether or not, like, I need to take 2 steps back and actually start validating, oh, right, okay, people actually behave in this way. People will actually pay money for this. There's a lot that goes into it. So as you evaluate concepts, it narrows down to where essentially, like, as you evaluate concepts, there's a ton of things that you can use to prototype those concepts out without actually having to write a line of code, right? Affogato in the front, they actually use storyboards to map out the entire process and then use it to talk with coffee farmers and co-ops to say, like, this is kind of what we're thinking for our product. Does this make sense? Is this interesting? They use, it's a simple process of like building out a storyboard. Another way is blogs and squeeze pages. So kind of as Katie was saying, when you talk to people, you get SMEs, you actually start building your beta list early. Blogs and squeeze pages to me is like an excellent way to sort of double dip. You can test people's interests. You can also start establishing yourself as kind of a leader in the field. You can even use different blog posts or different sort of searching through different sort of avenues to test out different features or different niches, which is really, really nice. Cheap marketing buys. This is one of my favorite sort of split A/B tests. Like, we actually have teams that have had different ideas that they were like, well, I don't know if we should do X or we should do Y. What we did is we took $100, we split it down the middle, we did 2 different marketing buys, and then basically like targeted the audience and said, like, which one do you want? Is this or this interesting? And we let the 2 marketing campaigns compete. The one that got the highest conversion is the one that we decided, oh, this is what the market is actually interested in. And then games. So especially useful for token economics. When we're designing marketplaces or ways in which we are assuming people behave in kind of complex scenarios, games is a great way to simulate that, right? Like, you don't have to get them to put a whole bunch of money down. They can start playing immediately. Everybody understands the concept of games. It's a really quick way for people to suspend reality and operate in sort of the reality that you're sort of projecting. TCR Party, in my opinion, is one of my favorite experiments that actually validated some of the behaviors that token curated registries was like kind of meant to imbue. So evaluating solutions. So basically, like, as you prove more and more things and you get closer to those specific solutions, they become a lot more concrete. You're actually testing out the solutions, right? You can do wireframes, clickable prototypes. You can even start coding things finally. But like, as you start validating the solutions, it becomes a much more concrete thing, and you're actually starting to model out the final solutions for those. So again, remember, oh, there we go. How do I know when I'm done? We already talked about how it's essentially, you can be done, and you can do these in a week and continue to iterate. remember this graphic, certainty, good bet. All you're essentially doing, you can never be 100% certain that what you're building is the right thing, but you want to get it close enough to where you know you're making a good bet. Jim Collins, Choosing to Be Great, fantastic book. If you want to read something that's about someone who's done a lot of research and study around entering markets, definitely read that. He has a great phrase, firing bullets and then firing cannonballs. Your cannonball is the product itself. It's coding, it requires a ton of time, a ton of resources, and it's an opportunity cost for your team. That's the cannonball. These are the small bullets that you fire to get up to that certainty. What makes a good bet? So every step of every project has different metrics, right? Like I can't tell you what your time is worth. I can't tell you what you're shooting for, what technologies you need to be like kind of building out. But I tend to use pretty basic napkin math with my teams whenever we're working through it. A napkin math bet is just basically you take a medium-sized feature, you say like, okay, well this is probably going to take 3 months, 3 ICs, three individual contributors, a dev and a design. Let's say you're paying market rate, $8K monthly. That's $100,000. These costs balloon out way quicker than we can imagine, and it gets away from us. So whenever we're thinking through these projects, we basically stop and we ask ourselves, okay, are we at least 100 grand worth of certain that this is a feature that we want to ship, or this is a product that we need to build? This is also really simplistic and not at all accurate. So if you like it's not taking into account opportunity costs, like what you could be building as opposed to building this. It doesn't take into account revenue, comparing the two different features. This is extremely simple, but it's also extremely effective in gauging the time, especially if you're a small team, working on the nights and weekends, right? Like that's how I basically gauge what projects I want to be working on and pursuing whenever I'm doing that. So how does ConsenSys inspire and practice this? So if you hear these things and you're like, wow, that sounds pretty cool, I want to try it out. We have a program, it's ConsenSys Relays. These are essentially decentralized hackathons that you can attend out of your own home, out of your own garage, if you're doing the Steve Jobs thing, and participate. They're 15 days. We have a whole bunch of curriculum and basically benchmarks at each of the 15 days for what you should be doing, who you should be talking to, how you should be working through it. And this is like, we've seen some pretty tremendous teams come out of it. Big fans of Affogato. Actually, like the three teams under here were both relays as well as microgrants. We also have a separate program called microgrants where we do gap analysis with teams that have won. And we do a gap analysis and work with them on like tiered funding unlocks basically and get them to kind of work towards where we see like the accelerator sort of launching point is for these teams, where they can start thinking about raising money. And Enable, Idle, and Affogato are alumni for that. Talk to them. We really enjoy the time that we spent working with them. And then finally, we have frameworks and curriculum. So if you want to do this asynchronously, we have all of this available for free on GitHub, open source. You can go check that out. And then we do YouTube. We essentially like do a whole bunch of interviews on YouTube. So we talk through the research methodology, prototyping. We talk to a whole bunch of biddlers, everyone from Austin Griffith to the CTO of the Washington Post. Ton of really interesting talks there as well. So.
Okay, so what should you guys take away from this talk? Design and research should be happening all the time within tight constraints to save time and generate those asymmetric insights, give you that advantage. Weigh opportunity costs with napkin math, like Zach said. Don't do anything without thinking about how much you could be doing, how much it costs, right? Research and prototyping, there's a couple insights here. Please make sure you're doing at least generative research, creating with users as you arrive at product market fit, and then make sure you're doing evaluative as well. Formative too, as I mentioned, if you need it. Prototyping, like Zach said, not viable, right? Don't need to be viable. Purpose of prototyping is to get to the degree of certainty that better bets. If you can only remember one thing from this talk, that scribble with the good bets line, remember that, write it down on your sheet every day. Test concepts and users' behaviors first and then specific solutions later. And then this concept of cupcake versus wedding cake, which is basically like you don't, to let someone try a wedding cake, you don't give them a piece of sponge and be like, the frosting will come later. You just imagine that part, right? You build them a small cupcake that has all the pieces of the big thing, so they can taste the whole experience in one. So think about that when you're building your prototypes as well. Like we said, if you want to do more, come find us at ConsenSysRelays.com, or right after this talk. We are the co-founders and co-directors of the program, so we're it. Come find us. Microgrants round 3 is opening in 2 weeks. Please apply if you're interested in getting funding unlocks and getting us to help you figure out what you need to do next. And please find us on Twitter at Caitlin B. Johnson. My name is spelled super weird, but if you find Zach, you'll be able to find me and Z Herring. And we will post a link to this deck with all of the rich resources, including all of these resources as well, as soon as we step off this stage. So thank you guys so much. We are right at time, and I know we probably don't have time for Q&A, but you can come find us after. We will be right here. So thank you so much.